The sound came first, an anomaly tearing through the white sacred silence of the blizzard. It wasn't the howl of the wind or the crack of a branch surrendering to the snow's weight. It was a mechanical thunder, a guttural, dissonant growl that seemed to vibrate the very snowflakes in the air. Asha Svoboda, 72, felt the tremor in the floorboards of her small wooden home, a deep resonance that disturbed the meticulous order of her universe. She was in the midst of her nightly routine of cataloging seeds, aligning brown paper packets in wooden boxes with an almost sacred precision. Every movement was deliberate, every thought a straight line. The sound was a violent curve, an intrusion. Outside, 15 headlights sliced through the snow curtain, transforming her isolated yard into an apocalyptic theater stage. 15 motorcycles, chrome and dark as polished bone, halted in an imperfect formation, their engines sputtering and finally dying in unison, leaving behind a silence, even heavier than before. Asha Svoboda had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at 68, a revelation that hadn't changed who she was, but had given a name to the complex symphony that had always played in her mind. She didn't process the world like others. She absorbed it in its purest components: patterns, textures, sounds, logic, and the logic of that scene was flawed. Motorcycles and blizzards were two variables that didn't belong in the same equation. She approached the window, her perfectly clean hands holding the lace curtain. 15 men hulking in their black leather gear dismounted their machines. They looked like clumsy giants in the deep snow, their movements slow and heavy. The patch on their backs was unmistakable, even through the storm. A winged skull. Hell's angels. Danger wasn't her first deduction. Confusion. Yes. A problem to be solved. The front door, which hadn't felt a knock in years, shuddered under a heavy fist. 1, 2, 3 knocks. Asha didn't move, she observed. The man at the front, a behemoth with a beard that looked like it had ice woven through it, raised his hand again. His name was Alexander Anderson, though Asha didn't know it. To her, he was simply the primary factor of disturbance. "Ma'am, anyone home?" His voice was gravelly, but not aggressive. It was the voice of a man who was cold. Logic began to reorder itself in Asha's mind. The blizzard had intensified in the last few hours, turning the mountain road into a deadly trap. Those men weren't here to cause trouble. They were stranded. They were a problem that had arrived at her doorstep. She opened it. The frigid wind surged into the house, carrying with it the scent of wet leather, gasoline, and desperation. Alexander Anderson, flanked by 2 other men whose faces were as hard as granite, blinked, surprised to see the small, slender woman with silver hair standing there, her face a mask of inquisitive calm. "Ma'am," he repeated. "Sorry to bother you. The road's closed, we're stuck. We need a place out of the storm. Anywhere. A barn, a garage, anything." Asha studied him. She didn't see the reputation, the leather patches, or the implicit threat. She saw his breath condensing into white clouds. She saw the way snow clung to his shoulders. She saw a system, a group of living beings, at risk of failure due to extreme environmental conditions. Her response was as simple as her analysis. "The barn is cold. Tools might rust. Come in." She stepped back from the door, leaving it open. The 15 men exchanged incredulous glances. They had expected shouts, a door slammed in their face, maybe the sight of a shotgun. They hadn't expected a calm, practical invitation to warmth. As they crowded into the small living room, clumsy and enormous amidst the delicate furniture and perfectly aligned bookshelves, Asha retreated to her kitchen. Their smell was overwhelming, a cacophony of odors that scraped at her senses. But routine was her anchor, and the routine for unexpected guests, however rare, was soup. She began to chop vegetables with rhythmic precision. Carrots, potatoes, onions, each cut an identical sound, the order of chaos. In a swift flashback as sharp as the scene before her, Asha saw herself in her yard a week prior. The sun was bright, the air crisp. Her neighbor, Julian Gallo Schwartz, was on the other side of the low fence, his face contorted into a condescending smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Asha, dear," he'd said, his voice oily, "this place is too much for you. Really consider my offer. A lady in your condition shouldn't have to deal with all this." The word condition hung in the air like poison. Julian saw her as an aberration, a faulty piece that disrupted his plan to buy the entire mountainside for luxury condominiums. He was Asha's only neighbor for miles, and his presence was a constant smudge on her peace. She'd ignored him as always, turning back to her rose bushes. She remembered another moment a month ago when she'd found a notice from the town tacked to her door, an anonymous complaint about yard debris and poorly maintained property. She knew it was Julian's doing. Her debris were composting projects and a bird sanctuary. Her property was a thriving ecosystem, not a sterilized lawn. The soup began to simmer, the aroma filling the house and overpowering the scent of wet leather. The men who had settled onto the floor, in the few available spaces, fell silent, mesmerized by the sound and the smell. Alexander Anderson watched the woman. There was something about her, a contained strength, a serenity he had only seen in war veterans or monks. She wasn't afraid of them. She didn't seem to even notice them as men, but as components to be managed. And that was somehow the greatest sign of respect he had ever received. Across the snow-covered valley, in his modern home with panoramic windows, Julian Gallo Schwartz watched the lights in Asha's house. He'd seen the motorcycles arrive before the blizzard worsened. A cruel smile spread across his face. Perfect. The old eccentric had finally gotten herself into trouble he could leverage. He picked up his phone to call the sheriff. The story would write itself. A frail, mentally unstable elderly woman, held hostage by a dangerous biker gang. It would be the final nail in the coffin of her resistance. He'd finally get that land. Here, in the small kitchen, as she served 15 bowls of hot soup. With steady hands, Asha Svoboda had no idea of the web her neighbor was weaving. She was simply solving the problem at hand, offering warmth to men trapped in a storm, while everyone in town saw her as fragile, eccentric, and broken. Her eyes held a serenity that only belongs to those who have weathered far worse storms, both internal and external, and survived to tell the tale. She held a secret too powerful to be revealed before its time. That order can be found in the most chaotic places, and true strength needs no noise to be heard. If this story of prejudice and perseverance has touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover how a simple act of kindness in a blizzard would become the catalyst for a revolution no one, especially a greedy neighbor, would ever forget. The night unfolded like a surreal tapestry. 15 of the most feared men on the road sat on the floor of Asha Svoboda's living room, eating vegetable soup in silence. The only conversation was the clatter of spoons against ceramic and the relentless howl of the wind outside. For the men, the situation was disconcerting. They were accustomed to commanding respect through fear, to occupying spaces with their overwhelming presence. But here, in this pristine home, they felt like bulls in a china shop, afraid of breaking something, not out of fear of retaliation, but out of an instinctual respect for the place's order. Asha, having completed the task of feeding, initiated the task of accommodation. She brought out blankets and pillows, all folded with military precision. She didn't say, "Make yourselves at home." She said, "Heat is retained most efficiently if bodies are clustered in the center of the room. The draft from the north window is 3.2 degrees Celsius. Avoid that area." Alexander Anderson watched, fascinated. She wasn't being hospitable in the conventional sense. She was being efficient. She saw a logistical problem and solved it. And in his world, where survival depended on logistics and seeing things as they are, without sentimentality, this was a language he understood perfectly. The next morning, the world was a blinding, silent white. The blizzard had stopped. It was then that the next disturbance arrived. Red and blue lights flashing against the snow, painting the room in alarm tones. Sheriff Clement White and 2 of his deputies were at the door, hands hovering over their weapons. "Mrs. Svoboda, are you all right?" The sheriff boomed, his gaze sweeping past her to the bikers who were now on their feet, tense as steel cables. Julian Gallo Schwartz's call had been compelling. He had painted a picture of terror, of a poor, defenseless old lady in mortal danger. "I am fine, Sheriff White," Asha replied, her voice monotone. A severe weather event occurred. These people required shelter. Shelter was provided. Sheriff White wasn't hearing her logic. He was seeing his prejudices confirmed. An eccentric woman and a gang of criminals. "Ma'am, please step outside so we can deal with these gentlemen." Alexander stepped forward. "There's nothing to deal with, Sheriff. The lady gave us shelter. We're grateful and will leave as soon as the roads are clear." But the sheriff's mind was already made up. He saw the situation through the lens Julian had given him. He treated Asha like an incapable child and the men like caged animals. After a tense identity check, all clear, to his disappointment, he gave them a stern warning to leave town as soon as possible, implying any deviation would be punished. Before leaving, he turned to Asha. "You need to be more careful, Asha. You can't trust people like that. We received a call from a concerned neighbor, Mr. Schwartz. He was very worried about your safety." Julian's name hung in the air. Alexander and his men exchanged a quick glance. The piece fit. This wasn't genuine concern. It was an attack. As the men prepared to try and dig their bikes out, one of them, a silent giant named Kamau Mackenzie, who was the group's mechanic, found Asha in her small basement workshop. He'd gone looking for a shovel and stumbled upon a sanctuary of order and function. Tools hung on painted outlines on the wall, bolts and nuts sorted by size and thread in dozens of labeled glass jars. He noticed an old disassembled lawnmower engine on a workbench, each part cleaned and tagged. You did this yourself?" he asked, his voice full of a reverence he rarely used. Asha nodded. The camshaft was worn by 0.3 millimeters. Replacement was inefficient. "I rectified it." Kamau smiled. A rare occurrence. He understood that. It was the same logic, the same mechanical beauty he saw in a perfectly tuned Harley-Davidson engine. He didn't see an eccentric old lady. He saw a colleague. Outside, Julian Gallo Schwartz watched the police cars leave and the bikers struggled to unearth their bikes. He felt triumphant. He had planted the seed in the sheriff's mind, and more importantly, in the IDI community. He picked up his phone and went to the local community Facebook page. With nimble fingers, he typed out a carefully crafted post, laced with false concern. "So relieved our neighbor Asha Svoboda is safe. An entire gang of Hell's Angels spent the night at her home. Thank God the police intervened. We need to keep an eye on our vulnerable elderly. Her condition makes her an easy target for people like that. It's a safety issue for our whole community." Reactions began to pour in. "Oh, my God, how scary. She shouldn't be living alone. We need an intervention." Julian smirked. He was turning the town's compassion and prejudice into a weapon against her. What he didn't know was that Bilal Hoang, the youngest member of the group and a tech whiz, was also seeing that post. He showed it to Alexander. The anger on the club leader's face was cold and dangerous. He looked at the house, at the woman who had given them shelter without asking for anything in return, who had treated them not as monsters but as a problem to be solved. And then he looked at the slanderous post that painted her as incompetent and them as predators. Julian's underestimation was total. He saw an elderly woman with autism as a helpless pawn in his real estate game. He saw 15 bikers as a bunch of stupid brutes. He couldn't conceive that the combination of the two could be anything beyond a victim and their aggressors. Every new online humiliation, every condescending comment about Asha's condition, only strengthened something within Alexander and his men that Julian couldn't see. A fierce loyalty, a quiet strength being fueled by the very injustice he tried to impose. For a moment, as Asha glanced at the commotion outside and simply went back inside to start washing the soup bowls, anyone might have thought she was oblivious, that her spirit was insulated. But those who know true strength know it needs no fanfare. It grows in silence, in routine, in the unyielding dignity of continuing to do what is right, no matter what chaos the world throws your way. The blizzard had passed, but a different storm was brewing. When Alexander Anderson and his men finally managed to free their bikes from the snow, they didn't depart immediately. They gathered on the roadside, a war council in black leather. The gratitude they felt for Asha had morphed into a fierce protective instinct. Julian Gallo Schwartz's post was not just an insult. It was a declaration of war on their honor and her dignity. "He's using her kindness against her," Kamau Mackenzie, the mechanic, said, his voice a low growl. "He's painting her as crazy so no one will listen when he drives her out of her home." Alexander nodded, his face a mask of cold determination. "He made a mistake. He thinks we're the problem. We're going to become her solution." Before they left, Alexander went to Asha's door. She met him there, holding a small wooden box. "For the road," she said. Inside there were sandwiches. each wrapped in waxed paper and tied with twine, and a thermos of coffee. Again, her practical logic disarmed him. "Mrs. Svoboda, Asha," he began, the formality seeming inadequate. "That neighbor of yours, he's a problem." Asha looked at him, her gaze direct. "He is an unbalanced equation. His variables are greed and disrespect. The result is disturbance. We'll balance the equation for you," Alexander promised. "We'll be back." With a curt nod, he was gone. The promise hung in the air, solid and heavy. In the days that followed, Julian intensified his campaign. He knew public opinion was his greatest weapon. His Facebook posts became more frequent, weaving a narrative of a community in peril due to an unstable neighbor. But then, something unexpected happened. A young freelance journalist named Riley Goldberg, who ran an investigative local blog focused on social injustices, saw the online uproar. Her gut told her the story wasn't as simple as a concerned neighbor. Julian's language was too polished, his concern too performative. Riley decided to visit Asha. At first, Asha was reluctant. Social interactions were draining, especially with strangers. But Riley was different. She didn't invade Asha's space. She spoke calmly, asked direct questions, and most importantly, she listened. She didn't interrupt. She waited through the silent pauses as Asha formulated her thoughts. She became an ally. Asha, sensing an integrity in Riley that was missing in almost everyone else in the world, showed her everything. Julian's lawyer letters, the town notices. She explained in her precise, logical way the systematic campaign of harassment she had been enduring for over a year. Riley recorded everything, her eyes widening at the calculated cruelty of Julian's plan. Meanwhile, far away, the Hells Angels' covert preparation was in full swing. They weren't just a bunch of brutes, they were a network. Bilal Huang, the tech expert, began digging deep into Julian Gallo-Schwartz's digital past. Other members who worked in construction, law, and logistics leveraged their contacts. They weren't looking for something to illegally incriminate him. They were looking for the pattern, the unbalanced equation Asha had mentioned, and they found it. Julian wasn't just an annoying neighbor. He was a serial real estate predator. They found a trail of at least 4 other instances in neighboring towns where elderly individuals, often widowed or with health issues, had been driven out of their homes through identical tactics: harassment, fabricated town complaints, and community smear campaigns to isolate them. They found sworn statements from victims' children, incriminating emails from Julian to his associates, public records showing he bought the properties for a fraction of their value and flipped them to developers for exorbitant profits. It was a cruel scheme, and Asha was merely his latest victim. Julian, blind with arrogance, took the next step in his plan. One morning, Asha woke to find a team of surveyors on her property. Julian, present, informed her with a smug smile that a property line reassessment showed her prize-winning rosebush, which her mother had planted 60 years ago, was technically on his land. Before she could process it, an excavator tore through the rose bushes, leaving a trail of ripped earth and broken stems. To Julian, it was checkmate. He had destroyed something he knew she loved. He expected it to break her. He even texted one of his partners, which Alexander's men would later retrieve. "The witch will finally yield." Destroyed her garden. Just a matter of time. But he fundamentally underestimated Asha's resilience. She looked at the destroyed rose bushes not with tears, but with a cold calm. It was more evidence of Julian's disorder, an illogical, destructive act. She picked up her gardening gloves and began salvaging the stems she could, one by one. That night, an encrypted data package was sent from Bilal Huang to journalist Riley Goldberg. It contained everything: the stories of the other victims, the property records, copies of the emails, irrefutable proof. At the same time, Alexander Anderson was on the phone, making a series of calls to chapter presidents across the state. The instructions were simple. Saturday morning, Asha's place. Bring your tools, and bring your brothers. It was as everyone in town, and especially Julian, was chuckling at the crazy old lady playing in the dirt with her dead shrubs. That something unexpected began to take shape. A silent plan, a network of loyalty forged on a snowy night, was about to manifest. Under the weight of all those condescending community stares, Asha continued her work, but those who watched closely would notice it wasn't desperation in her movements. It was preparation. It was the calm of someone who knows help is on the way, the calm of someone about to see her own story, and that of her oppressor, indelibly rewritten. Saturday dawned, clear and cold. Julian Gallo-Schwartz sipped his coffee on his porch, looking with satisfaction at the scar of earth he had created on Asha's property. He felt invincible. His final post the night before, lamenting the necessity of removing the overgrown bushes for safety reasons, had solidified his image as a model citizen. Asha's defeat was imminent. It was then he heard it. At first, it was a distant hum, like a swarm of angry bees on the horizon, but the hum grew, becoming a growl, then a roar, a seismic thunder that seemed to make the windows of his house tremble. He stood up, coffee forgotten in his hand, and his face paled. Descending the mountain road in a perfect two-column formation came a river of chrome and steel. It wasn't 15 bikes. It was 50, 70, 100. 100 motorcycles. Hell's Angels from all corners of the state thundered down the quiet street and stopped in a silent, disciplined line in front of Asha Svoboda's house. The silence that followed, the kill switches was more deafening than the noise. Doors creaked open in neighboring houses. Faces appeared in windows. Panic began to bubble in Julian's chest. "Invasion! They're coming for me!" He shrieked into his phone, frantically dialing Sheriff Clement White. "They'll kill me! Send everyone!" But the bikers weren't looking at his house. Led by Alexander Anderson, they headed directly for Asha's property. She was there, waiting on the porch, a tray of cups and a pitcher of ice water in hand. She nodded to Alexander, and he nodded back. It was all the communication needed. Then, the twist began. The men didn't pull out guns. They pulled out shovels, rakes, saws, and hammers. From the back of a support truck, they unloaded cedar posts, rolls of wire mesh, bags of soil, and dozens of new rose bushes. In an operation that moved with the precision of a military unit, they began to work. Half the group started ripping out the remnants of Asha's old, broken fence. The other half began digging holes for a new, much sturdier and more beautiful one. A smaller group, led by Kamau Mackenzie, descended upon the damaged garden, preparing the soil with reverent care. They weren't there to destroy. They were there to build. At the exact moment the first shovel hit the ground, Julian's phone and the phones of everyone in town vibrated with a notification. Riley Goldberg's blog had published a new article. The headline was explosive: "The Mountain Predator. How Julian Gallo. Schwartz systematically terrorizes seniors to steal their homes." The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It had everything. Detailed stories of the other victims, with names and dates, copies of the fraudulent legal documents, screenshots of Julian's Facebook posts about Asha, juxtaposed with the cruel emails he sent about his other targets. It was a public execution, meticulous and irrefutable. When Sheriff Clement White arrived with 2 patrol cars, he found not a violent riot, but a scene of community construction. He saw the men working, saw Asha serving them water, and then his own phone vibrated. He read the headline of Riley's article. His face went from anger to confusion, and finally, to a grim understanding. He had been used. He was a pawn in Julian's game. Julian, in a panic, stumbled out of his house, screaming, "Sheriff, arrest them! They're trespassing! They're on my property!" Alexander Anderson paused what he was doing, wiped his hands on his leather pants, and calmly walked over to him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply handed Julian a document. It was an emergency restraining order obtained by a lawyer who was a club member, prohibiting Julian from coming within 100 meters of Asha or her property, based on the now public evidence of harassment. Then, Alexander picked up his own phone and showed Julian Riley's article, slowly scrolling down, past the testimonials, past the evidence. Julian's face crumpled, the arrogance drained away, replaced by the pure terror of exposure. Every like, every share, every comment on the article was a nail in his social and financial coffin. He looked at the neighbors who were now watching him, not with fear of the bikers, but with contempt for him. He looked at the sheriff, whose face was like stone. He looked at the 100 men building a sanctuary for the woman he tried to destroy. He had not been defeated by violence. He had been defeated by kindness. He had been undone by a community he could never understand, united to protect a woman he considered insignificant. Asha Svoboda acted with the class and dignity that had always defined her. She didn't gloat. She didn't watch her enemy fall. She walked over to the group working on her garden and, with the tip of her finger, indicated the exact spot where the first new rose bush should be planted to catch the morning sun perfectly. She was focused on rebuilding, not on ruin. As the revelations mounted and the masks fell, one question hung in the air. Could bridges be built over such deep chasms of prejudice? The answer was there, in the sight of a tattooed giant, taking gardening advice from an elderly lady, in the sound of hammers building a protective fence, and in the silence of a bully who finally realized he had underestimated the strength of the people he tried to break. Julian Gallo-Schwartz's fall was as swift as it was complete. Riley Goldberg's article went viral, not just in the small town, but across the region. The stories of the other victims garnered statewide news coverage. Within a week, a class action lawsuit was filed against him, and the district attorney announced a criminal investigation for fraud and extortion. He became a pariah. The friends who liked his posts now pretended not to know him. His business partners cut all ties. In less than a month, a for sale sign was erected in front of his modern, empty house. He sold at a loss and disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a cautionary tale of arrogance. As Julian's empire crumbled, Asha Svoboda's world blossomed in ways she never imagined. The new cedar fence was a symbol of security, and the garden, replanted with the care of 100 hands, became more beautiful than ever. But the most profound transformation wasn't in the landscape, it was in the community. The townspeople, shamed for having fallen for Julian's lies, began to reach out to Asha. At first, hesitantly, with apologies and offers of help. They no longer saw her as the eccentric old lady, but as the resilient woman who stood up to a predator and won. They saw the strength in her calm, the wisdom in her logic. They began to understand that her autism wasn't a disability, but a different lens through which she saw the world with a clarity they themselves lacked. Asha, in turn, found a new routine. The visits from the Hells Angels became a regular event. They didn't come in a swarm, but in small groups, on Saturdays. Alexander Anderson, Kamau Mackenzie, Bilal Huang, and the others became her unlikely family. They fixed her roof, sharpened her gardening tools, and sat on her porch, listening to her talk about bird migration patterns or soil composition. In return, they brought her stories from the road, a chaos that somehow found order in her calming presence. She never tried to change them, and they never tried to change her. They simply accepted each other, a group of misfits who found common ground in loyalty and mutual respect. Asha thrived. With Riley Goldberg's encouragement, she started a small program for local children, teaching them to grow their own vegetables. Her garden became an outdoor classroom. The children were fascinated by her precise mind and her vast knowledge of nature. She discovered that her ability to explain complex systems simply was a gift. She was no longer a recluse. She was a mentor, an unlikely matriarch for the town and for a motorcycle club. A year after that fateful blizzard, Asha sat on her porch watching Alexander Anderson teach a little boy how to identify a ladybug. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the colors of her roses. She realized that Julian Gallo-Schwartz, in his attempt to isolate and destroy her, had given her the greatest gift of all, a community. He had forced her out of her ordered shell and into connecting with the world in a way she never would have on her own. The best revenge, she understood, wasn't seeing her enemy suffer. It was building a life so full and happy that the memory of him became insignificant. The final lesson of that saga wasn't about power or retribution. It was about the invisible strength of integrity and the truth that family isn't defined by blood, but by loyalty. It's about understanding that the strongest people aren't the loudest, but those who, like a redwood tree, silently endure the storms, only to grow taller and more steadfast. And you, what would you have done in Asha's place? Let us know in the comments if you've ever found strength in the most unexpected places, or if you've witnessed justice prevail against all odds. Your story matters. If tales of overcoming adversity like this inspire you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss the next story that proves that sometimes karma doesn't come in lightning, but in the roar of 100 loyal engines. He tried to destroy Asha Svoboda, but ended up destroying himself. Asha learned that true revenge isn't returning the harm suffered. It's achieving the success, peace, and happiness your enemies could never imagine for you.